Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's learning session, Forest and Climate Outcomes from Bonn, organized by World Wildlife Fund's Forest and Climate Program. Thanks for taking the time to join us. My name is Breen Burns, and I'm a communications manager for our team, and our presenter today is Josefina Braña Varela, Policy Director for the WWF Forest and Climate Program. And before we begin, I'd like to go over a few logistics and frequently asked questions. For those of you who have participated in our previous sessions, this sounds familiar, so thank you for your patience, but we do have a new format here. Today's presentation is being recorded, and you can find the recording within a few days on our YouTube channel. To get to the recording, just go to youtube.com and search for WWF Forest and Climate. There are two audio options. You can listen through your computer, or you can dial in through the phone number that was provided in your registration email. It's important to note that if you experience audio difficulties while listening through your computer, this sometimes happens if you have too many browser windows or programs open. So feel free to close some of them, and that usually solves the issue, or you can always dial in through the phone. If you're having any technical troubles, please send Jenny Guzman, my colleague, a message via the chat area if possible, and she will try to help you get it figured out. And questions are absolutely welcome. You can send your questions using the toolbar on your screen, and we will answer as many as possible during our allotted time. And after the webinar, you'll receive a link in the follow-up email with forest and climate resources from WWF, and you'll also receive a link to the YouTube channel where this recording will be posted. So thank you again for joining us, and with that, we'll get started, and I will turn it over to Josefina. So Josefina, please go ahead.
Thank you, Breen, and good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, wherever you are, in whatever part of the world. So today, our webinar is going to be about what the recent subsidiary bodies meeting in Bonn and what were the results in terms of the RED negotiations. But for doing that, I'm going to give a little bit of context about very quickly going to the origins and evolution of RED under the UNFCCC. We're going to have a little bit of a refresher on the Warsaw Framework for RED Plus, and then I'll explain what happened in Bonn, what are the next steps, and I will share some final thoughts. So let's start with the next slide, and this is only to show you the progression of the RED concept in the UNFCCC. So just to remind you that way back in 1997, discussions about avoided deforestation first came up in the international discussions on forest and climate as a potential opportunity to be included under the Kyoto Protocol. But the reason why back in 1997 this activity or this avoided deforestation concept was left out was because there was not enough information, technical information, and specifically technical information that could allow us to have robust monitoring, reporting and verification system. Back then probably was not called MRV, but the technical difficulties discouraged parties to keep discussing about this. So it was until 2005 that actually the discussions on RED took over a formal place in the SOFSTA agenda. Back in COP11, we started seeing the discussions on reducing emissions from deforestation in the discussions from parties. Later on in 2007, RED became REDD to include the dimension of degradation, given that many parties share the concerns that in many countries the big problem was degradation. So both deforestation and degradation were included, and as you know, in 2010, in COP16 in Cancun, is when finally we see the 5 activities of RED laid out in the decision 1CP16, which we can find deforestation, degradation, and also the plus as conservation and enhancement of carbon stocks and sustainable management of forests. So what happened after 2010 is that parties start focusing more, now that they have laid out the activities and agree on these 5 activities for this RED Plus approach, they started discussing about the rules and how such a mechanism will work. So by the time they reached COP19 in 2013 in Warsaw, they agreed on the Warsaw Framework for RED+, which is known as the RED rulebook. However, in Warsaw, there were still 3 technical issues that were open under the agenda item in the technical discussions that were not decided, and that kept discussions going on in Lima. Last year, parties could not agree on how to resolve these 3 technical issues. But now in this, in the latest subsidiary bodies meeting that took place in Bonn a couple of weeks ago, finally parties come into an agreement. So we expect in Paris to see the adoption of the decisions, and with this it would be the end of the RED technical negotiations. And it's important to highlight the dimension of technical negotiations, because there are other issues that are unresolved. So I just wanted to give you this like brief walk through the origins and evolution of RED and where are we standing now. Also highlight that the discussions around avoided deforestation under the Kyoto Protocol were more focused in this idea of projects, developing projects that could be compensating emissions in developed countries. So paying for developing countries to have some projects that could you know, capture some carbon, and therefore it would be considered as an offset mechanism. That was way back at the beginning, and what we have now at the end with the technical rules adopted is more a national commitment. RED is a national commitment. It's not isolated projects, but it has to be under an umbrella of a national strategy of action plan. It's consider multiple sources of finance: public, private, bilateral, multilateral, market, non-market. And the decisions are very, very open and very flexible in that sense. And also it can be implemented at various scales according to national circumstances. So it depends on how the country develops the national strategy or action plan and how it decides to implement it, the level or the different scale at which they will have actions. Okay, so let's move forward just to talk a little bit about the Warsaw Framework for RED, which is, as I mentioned, considered as the rule book for RED+. The Warsaw Framework was adopted in 2013, and it has 7 decisions that you can see in the screen at the moment. One decision that was adopted under the COP work program on results-based finance for RED+. And the highlights, we have done this in previous webinars, but just for you to remember, some of the highlights of this decision is, well, establish for the first time explicit link between RED+ and the Green Climate Fund. So it highlights the key role that the Green Climate Fund will have in channeling RED+ resources, and it also establishes the information hub, which is the repository of information that the convention will have, in which all countries will have to submit their different information about reference levels, monitoring systems, etc. And it makes the explicit link to safeguards in order to access finance. So whoever wants to access results-based payments needs to inform how they are addressing and respecting the safeguards before this could happen. And I think that was a very important point of this decision. Then you have the joint process that was open at the time between the SOFSTA, the subsidiary body for scientific and technological advice, and the SBI, which is a subsidiary body of implementation. And these 2 bodies have this joint process to try to discuss or come up with some decision about the coordination of support for the implementation of RED activities. And this was brought by many parties that were concerned about the lack of coordination and the difficulties in access results-based, in access RED finance in general, because of the multiple requirements from different multilateral organisms, etc. So this decision was adopted. The main highlights is that they created a national entity of focal point. So each country has to designate this national entity and focal point, and it established that these representatives of the national entity of focal point should meet annually, well, it's on a voluntary basis on this annual meeting of the focal points to discuss gaps and needs and to share challenges, barriers, and opportunities. Also inviting multilateral and bilateral entities. So that was established, and this annual meeting took place also in Bonn. I'm going to touch a little bit on that a little bit later. And the third pillar of the Warsaw Framework for RED is the 5 decisions that were adopted under SOBSTA, and these are really the design elements, the base of RED+. So one is the decision made about national forest monitoring systems, the decision made around safeguards, but only addressing time and frequency to present the summary of information on how countries are addressing and respecting safeguards. And then the guidelines and procedures for the technical assessments of reference levels, the provisions for MRV, and the very, very short decision on drivers of deforestation, which it's not very substantial, but at least it reiterates that countries need to include in their strategies a clear path to address the drivers of deforestation and forest degradation. So that is a summary of the Warsaw Framework for RED, and that's what it was decided in Warsaw. And for me, it was important to make this point before we can analyze what happened in Bonn. So now we can move forward. And in this session of the subsidiary bodies, there were still 3 topics open, or 3 issues open under the RED agenda item in SOBSTA. As I mentioned, coming out of Warsaw, the 3 topics were still open, and in Lima they could not agree on them. The first topic is this issue of safeguards. So the SOBSTA mandate was to consider need for further guidance on ensuring transparency, consistency, comprehensiveness, and effectiveness when informing on how the Cancun safeguards are being addressed and respected. So this was an ongoing discussion for many, many years, polarized discussions actually between developed and developing countries in general about the need to have further guidance on how countries needed to show that they were addressing and respecting safeguards. Developing countries or RED countries were not willing to adopt further guidance because they said that they needed to go through their own process and really acknowledge the national circumstances. So they thought that further guidance was not going to be useful, at least at this point in time. And the other position of developed countries was like, yes, we would like to have further guidance and have more certainty or more clarity on the way the summaries of information are going to be structured and what kind of information they are going to contain. So this was an ongoing negotiation for many sessions, and the discussion was finally concluded in Bonn a couple of weeks ago in this session that just took place. Just to let you know, well, for WWF, it was important to adopt further guidance that was supportive of developing countries' efforts in implementing RED and not creating a burden, but we thought that there was a need to have more information on how countries interpret RED safeguards into the national circumstances, what kind of policy or legal frameworks they have to address the safeguards. And we were asking for countries to share information regarding criteria and indicators they use at the national level to make sure that they are on track on their safeguards process. That was the call for that WWF made for countries and parties to adopt. But what we can see in the decisions adopted or agreed in Bonn is the decision that is very general. It's not as strong as we would like to be. It reiterates that information should ensure these principles of transparency, consistency, comprehensiveness, and effectiveness, but it's just a reiteration and it doesn't say how. It establishes that countries, when providing this information, need to make sure that they say which of the 5 activities they are referring to in the report of safeguards. And they are also asked to provide information on how they interpret the safeguards in the national context, including some categories of type of information. However, if you see the text of the decision is very soft because it strongly encourages parties to do so, but it's not a requirement to provide this information. So that is, in a nutshell, really what the decision on safeguards has. As you can see, no further specific information was required. There's still not clarity on how countries are going to be presenting the information, especially not only for the part of addressing the safeguards, but respecting. And I think that's the main point of attention, because each country will provide different information about legal frameworks, institutions, etc. But that doesn't mean that we will have parameters or information to know what is happening in terms of respecting the safeguards. So I think we'll have to wait and see. Countries are moving forward with these summaries of information. I think many countries are really committed to address and respect safeguards, and the national circumstances are really, really very diverse. So we'll have to wait and see when the summaries of information are submitted. And I think one of the highlights of the Warsaw Framework for RED is that all the information needs to be put in the information hub. So it's going to be very transparent, and everybody will be able to see these reports. At least this is a good practice. So the second topic on the discussion that was still open was the topic of non-carbon benefits. And for that, the SOFSTA mandate said that SOFSTA needed to consider methodological issues related to non-carbon benefits resulting from RED activities. This discussion on non-carbon benefits was first proposed by a group of countries, mainly from Africa. And I think the concerns they expressed, and they were more explicitly addressed in Bonn, was the fact that many countries were not getting the right support they needed to start their readiness processes or to move forward with their national RED strategies or the RED efforts. So that was materialized in Bonn through a submission that the African group put together. So these discussions were led by this group of countries, pointing out the need to recognize that there are different countries with more needs in terms of other benefits that are not carbon. For example, they were referring to enabling conditions. For example, let me think on some activities that they were pointing out governance issues, how to strengthen the governance structures, or other non-carbon benefits, for example, how to improve their frameworks for, let's say, for watershed management. So there were a wide variety of non-carbon benefits being mentioned. And I guess the main point that the African countries wanted to make is that there should be this explicit recognition on these other benefits that need to be supported. And that was the key link and the main point on the discussion, whether the non-carbon benefit should be rewarded differently or separately from RED, that the measurement has been established to be on carbon tons. So that was a discussion in Bonn, and there was a very exhaustive discussion about how to address the concerns of this group of countries, but at the same time how not to create more requirements for RED countries in addition to those established already in the Warsaw Framework for RED. So actually what you can see here is a tension from this group of countries that propose these features or these elements or this guidance that had to be adopted, and actually other group of RED countries that were not really comfortable with adopting more guidance or additional guidance that would be making RED more complicated. And you also see a group of developed countries or donor countries expressing some concern about how would you pay or reward these other non-carbon benefits, on what basis, what measurements, how you would monitor these other benefits. So at the end, I think, again, the decision, it's a decision that is not very sophisticated or elaborated in methodological guidance for non-carbon benefits, especially because since the beginning they were questioning how do you define these non-carbon benefits. So what you will see in the decision, it's the recognition of the importance of non-carbon benefits, in particular for the long-term sustainability of REDD+. There's a recognition that the non-carbon benefits are unique to national circumstances, so it's reiterating that these non-carbon benefits will depend or will vary from one country to the other. And then the more substantive part of the decision is that, well, it invites countries that want to do so to share information on the nature, the scale, and the importance of these non-carbon benefits, and it makes a call or encourages financial entities to consider additional support or to consider looking at this information on non-carbon benefits and encourage to provide support that is needed for these countries that are providing this information. However, the decision is very explicit to say that these methodological issues do not contribute any additional requirement for development countries seeking support for REDD+. So pretty much it's voluntary. It's not clearly establishing mandatory link to support, to financial support, but it I guess it encourages countries that want to do so to at least provide this information. So the result and the impact of this decision in real life is it's really uncertain, right? Because we won't be able to know. There is no an obligation to reward for these benefits. So we'll have to wait. Maybe by providing information, there will be some sources of finance that are interested in supporting this topic. Okay, so the next slide is about the third topic that was open for a while, actually, since Cancun. There was this discussion about the non-market-based approaches, such as the joint mitigation and adaptation approach proposed by Bolivia. Bolivia has been proposing this alternative policy approach to REDD for many years now, and the mandate that SOFSTA had was the consideration of the development, again, of methodological guidance on non-market-based approaches, such as this joint mitigation and adaptation approach for the integral and sustainable management of forest, which is the formal title that Bolivia proposed in their submission, in their several submissions that they have done to the convention. So about this topic, there was a big discussion about whether we are only talking about this Bolivian proposal or we are talking only about, in general, about non-market-based approaches. The main difference that Bolivia was making with regard, well, there were many differences with regard to REDD, but Bolivia was saying, well, first of all, my alternative approach is going to be non-market-based. And it's going to be not only based in carbon tons. Like the only measure that REDD is using right now for results is the carbon tons. So Bolivia was like, no, the forests are more complex than that, and there are other values that the forest contribute. So they were trying to develop a different approach, and they wanted to have some sort of methodological guidance similar to the one that was developed for REDD, but for this alternative approach. So for many sessions, Bolivia was proposing different formulations, and the parties were negotiating different features and elements that they could agree to have this alternative approach in place. But what you can see in the results in Bonn is that no further methodological guidance was adopted, but there are a set of provisions that were written in this decision. One is that the countries that wish to do so can use this alternative approach towards achieving emissions reductions through this joint mitigation and adaptation approach, but they are required, if they choose to follow this approach, to develop a national strategy or action plan in order to support this integral and sustainable management of forest. So it's kind of like mirroring a little bit the similar process for REDD. REDD, you have to have a national strategy. For JMA, or the Joint Mitigation and Adaptation Mechanism, you also have to propose a national strategy. You will have to identify the needs for support in order to implement your national strategy or action plan. And then, again, similar to the non-carbon benefits discussion, financing entities are encouraged to continue to provide support for these kind of approaches. And here I only wanted to highlight that there's already room to channel this support from the GCF, because in the results management framework of the GCF, you can see that there's already some results areas that consider both mitigation and adaptation. So it could be one opportunity there to do so. And the other feature that we wanted to highlight here is that at some point in the discussions, there was some proposal that the joint mitigation and adaptation mechanism would not be tied to the Cancun safeguards. But this decision worked out in Bonn. It makes explicit link to the REDD safeguards, saying that the countries that are moving forward with this alternative approach will have to observe the Cancun safeguards adopted back in 2010. Okay, so before we move forward with the next slide, these are the three topics that were open, the topics that were discussed in Bonn and that were resolved along the lines I just explained. As you can see, these are not very elaborated decisions. They are not very long decisions. The way it was agreed and discussed in Bonn, it was, they had very intense discussions and very intense negotiations. At some point, very polarized discussions. We thought that they were not going to be able to reach an agreement, but they managed to get an agreement. And I think one strategy that several parties were pursuing is to see this as a package of decisions, meaning that many countries were not willing to discuss one topic and not the other, but actually they were proposing to take it all or leave it all. So that I think that a strategy at the end will make that they managed to adopt the three decisions in a scenario that seemed very difficult and very polarized, but they managed to agree. As you can imagine, given that for some of the topics the decisions were really opposed, I think that that is why the result that is reflected in the decisions is very general. So decisions are not really powerful or really strong because you have to accommodate the different positions from developed countries, developing countries, people that wanted more guidance for non-carbon benefits, people that didn't want to have a different alternative approach from REDD, etc. So at the end, you have a set of decisions that even they are not perfect, they are not very strong, but is what you get when you have to work out consensus with a group of parties. So that's a strategy they follow, and I think that's why they managed to reach agreement. So what is going to happen now is that this SOBSTA adopted the draft conclusions and these three decisions, and these decisions are now they have been forwarded by they have been forwarded to the COP to be adopted in Paris. So can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so what are the next steps right now towards Paris and beyond? So we have talked about the technical negotiations and how they are over and how the REDD rules are in place. So now from here to Paris, there will be a couple of intersessionals, but mostly focused in discussing the new climate agreement. So for this, our priority is to guaranteeing the explicit mention of REDD in the new climate agreement under negotiation. In particular, it would be very important to have explicit mention of REDD Plus under the finance section of the climate agreement. The second point is, well, we are going to be advocating for the inclusion of the land sector, including forest, of course, in the agreement. So far, the discussions about the agreement are very slow, and the text is still very long, and there are multiple options in the table. And there are two trends. One trend that is pushing for a sector neutral agreement, meaning that would be a very broad agreement that doesn't single out or make explicit mentions of different sectors. So therefore, we won't be able to see the land sector explicitly mentioned if parties choose to go from that approach. But on the other hand, there's another trend and parties pushing for having some specific provisions for key sectors, such as the land sector, which is of utmost importance, for example, for food security, and that is important for adaptation, and it's important for mitigation. It's important for human rights and for indigenous peoples. So because of the special characteristics of the land sector, some parties would like to have some special mentions and provisions that apply for the land sector. For us, it's very important that whatever is the approach that parties will follow, it's important to recognize that the land sector plays a key role, given that it represents 25% of the global emissions. So we cannot leave out a sector that is so important for climate change. So the other priority that we should keep in mind is that it's not only about the new climate agreement and post-2020. There's lots of things to do before 2020. So there's these discussions on the work stream 2 of the ADP, the ad hoc platform, the Durban platform. And this is where it's been discussed how we can close the gigaton gap. So we need to promote immediate actions in the forest sector, including through REDD, to help this gigaton gap. And I think there are multiple initiatives that are ready and that could contribute significantly to that objective. And then the next point is beyond the UNFCCC, or not beyond, but in parallel to this new agreement and pre-2020, post-2020, there's this process of the intended nationally determined contributions, which are the commitments that parties need to put in the table by latest in September. And these intended nationally determined contributions for many, many countries would be key to include the land sector and the forest sector in these indices. So we are promoting this. We're trying to work with some countries and help support information that could advise or that can inform these processes, so countries can include and take into consideration this sector in the INDCs. And then the topic that is still open, and it's always a matter of discussion, and is how are we going to ensure that there will be adequate and predictable support for all phases of REDD. So we are going to be working with different key sources of finance, including the Green Climate Fund, which has developed already the REDD logic model, and the results management framework of the GCF already include results that are related to forest and the land sector. But we have to ensure that the adequate and predictable support will be there to support REDD implementation in the long term. So these are the next steps towards Paris and beyond, and I will only finish with some final thoughts in the next slide, yes, about how we can play different roles from our different perspectives and positions. I think for governments outside the UNFCCC, there's still much more to do to keep working in developing and implementing their national REDD strategies or action plans, and to really, really achieve these transformational effects that are needed at all levels of policy. What we've seen so far is very focalized efforts to develop national strategies and activities to strengthen policy frameworks, legal frameworks, etc. But one thing that is missing and that we know and acknowledge that is taking longer, but it needs to happen, is that at the national level we have to break the silos, and countries need to start working cross-sectorally. So there will be the need to coordinate between the ministries of agriculture, ministries of energy, and the forest agency. It cannot be only an effort that is driven by the forest agency of the Ministry of Environment. We need to break these silos. As civil society organizations and other key organizations, I think there's a key role in enabling progression of these national strategies, providing technical support, policy advice, and helping to create and build, to create and strengthen the local capacities. for non-state actors, that lately we hear more and more about these other non-state actors, I think it's key to highlight the role that the private sector needs to play, especially when we are talking about addressing the drivers of deforestation. The private sector can be a key player to really make this happen. But there are many non-state actors that are key. I think in the center of RED, we can find the indigenous peoples and local communities that are really, really key, both in driving the decision-making processes and strategies that work in the ground, and be a part of the implementation of these successful strategies. So I think there's still more work to do. I think my final message is, yes, it seems like the technical negotiations are over. There may be other issues that will be needed to clarify after Paris, but from now to Paris, we just need to focus in implementing and moving forward as much as we can in implementation. One last thing that I forgot to mention is about this focal points meeting. It took place, the first voluntary meeting in Bonn. This is a meeting that is wider than parties. NGOs can participate and other stakeholders can participate. But the focal point meeting was very, very general. There was not really substantial discussions that could progress or provide a nice space to exchange information about challenges, opportunities, or valuable information. Instead, the focal points meeting was very, very narrow, talking about an update of GCF, an update of the GEF, and not much exchange was promoted among parties. So we'll have to try to influence that the agenda of these voluntary meetings could be a little bit more efficient and more productive for next year. Will take place again in June in Bonn. Although there are some suggestions of hosting this meeting in a different setting, which is not linked to the negotiations, that could be more technical discussions or more substantial discussions, and not to just to change one negotiator from a negotiating room to sit in the focal points meeting and hoping that they will be discussing other substantial information about implementation, not about negotiations. So now, ready to have any questions that you may want to discuss.
Thank you, Josefina. And to kick us off, if you could address how progress in Bonn is different than what happened in Warsaw, just to give us some background.
Yeah, sure, that's a good question. I think what happened in Warsaw is that we adopted this rule book. We saw the countries agreeing in the design elements of RED and in the elements that the countries need to develop in order to access results-based finance. And what we see in Bonn is the conclusion of the technical discussions that were issues that were left, but were not really part of the core rule book. So I think in that sense, for me, Warsaw is more important than what happened in Bonn, but what happened in Bonn is it's more symbolic in the sense of sending a signal that negotiations are over, implementation is now.
Thank you. So the next question is from Adriana, and Adriana writes, it seems that the dichotomy between developed and developing countries resulted in a mild decision on guidelines for safeguards rather than a decision with more details on how safeguards should be addressed and reported. So in your opinion, Josefina, what was the substantial achievement reached with the decision related to safeguards, and what would you say is the positive outcome of this decision?
Yeah, well, I think I completely agree. I mean, that's my own assessment, is that the discussions were so polarized between developed and developing countries that what you get is a result that is very diluted and is not as strong as we wanted to be. We really wanted to see more clear guidance on what kind of information countries will have to submit. I think the main I guess highlight is to reiterate the need to have this the summaries of information to really ensure transparency, consistency, and comprehensiveness of how they are addressing and respecting safeguards. There's some very, very light guidance on, for example, clarify what red activity you are referring to, and also include the type of information that you are linking to each activity of red. But frankly, it's in realistic terms, I think the main achievement is in the decision of Warsaw, when everything has to be transparent. Because even when this decision is very weak and it doesn't really ensure you consistency, or that you don't know what you're going to get, frankly, with this decision, right? And it's still not guaranteeing you that you will have to have all the complete information that you will want to make an assessment. For me, it's more important the decision that was made in Warsaw, in which everything has to be transparent, so everybody, civil society, academia, and whoever wants can check out the summaries of information and have an open dialogue and discussion about this.
Thank you. And so just as a reminder for everyone, we're open for questions, so you can use the question button on your GoToWebinar toolbar to submit the questions, and then those come through to us and we'll go from there. So the next question, Josefina, I'm going to take this question from Rosa, and Rosa asks, could you please explain more about the alternative approach proposed by Bolivia, and practically speaking, what is a non-market-based approach and how would it work?
Sure. So Bolivia was proposing a mechanism distinct from RED, in the sense that for Bolivia, RED was conceived as a market mechanism. So they wanted to make sure that the approach that they wanted to pursue is a non-market mechanism. However, if you see all the decisions that have been adopted, and as I explained, the evolution of RED Plus, RED can be market, non-market, bilateral, multilateral, public, private, etc. Still, Bolivia really wanted to do their own, to have recognition of their own approach, even when RED actually, if you see all the decisions, RED could accommodate the Bolivian proposal. But Bolivia proposed a framework that it goes beyond carbon. I think that's another important feature, that the monitoring, or the base of, how do you say, the proxy of results should not be only carbon, should be other values that the forests provide. So that's why they wanted to have the different methodological guidance for this joint mitigation and adaptation, and also recognizing that the efforts that countries do are not only for mitigation, but are also useful for adaptation. So Bolivia has been pushing this approach for a while. The difficulty that I saw in the negotiations is that parties would not be able to make the distinction between what has been proposed and what was already created within RED. But still, because we were really pushing for recognizing different national circumstances approaches, I think countries recognized that that Bolivia wanted to pursue this different alternative policy approach that is explicitly mentioned under non-market-based mechanisms, and that's what happened at the end. You can see the decision since COP17, addressing the existence of these alternative approaches, recognizing that there could be these other non-market-based approaches, such as the joint mitigation and adaptation mechanism. And this is what it means for Bolivia, is that they are making a national decision on receiving public finance to support their strategy, and they are making the conscious decision on not participating in any market that involves carbon trading. That's the implication of their scheme. Whereas with RED, a country can decide whether they can go to market or non-market.
Sounds great. Thank you for that explanation. So the next question is, so what can we expect in Paris now that this track of technical negotiations has finished? So what do you think we'll see there in terms of RED?
Well, the decisions were adopted or were agreed on SOBSTA, but the COP needs to adopt these decisions to make them formal. So in Paris, you will see 3 decisions regarding RED, the decisions that we just discussed in this webinar, being adopted and be formalized and published. And then in parallel, as I mentioned, we'll have to work out in the links of RED to the climate agreement, which is also very important. It's not only about the technical discussions and COP decisions, but how in this new climate agreement that hopefully would be adopted, how RED takes a explicit mention on it.
Thank you. So the next question is from Fayed, and Fayed asks, will WWF country offices be in a position to work with RED plus NFPs? And I don't know what NFP stands for. Does WWF plan to build in-house capacities to engage in RED plus processes in countries? So I think that's a good chance to talk about the work that we do, Josefina.
Yeah, and I think this may relate to focal points. Yes, so yeah, we do have already activities in different countries where we have WWF offices. We've been very active in Peru, Colombia, DRC, Indonesia, and Guyana. And we work with the field teams in building the capacities in the ground to progress these national strategies or action plans. So we always try to be really in coordination and in consistency with the national plans or with the government plans. So we make sure that we are all working towards the same vision and towards the same, achieving the same goal. We have different strategies depending on the circumstances, the local circumstances. I can give you an example. In Peru, we developed a certificate course on MRV to try to build capacities in Madre de Dios of a wide range of stakeholders that could understand what are the requirements that are needed under the convention and what technical capacities need to be in place. This course was very, very successful, and what we created, or at least I think we managed to contribute to create some sort of resilience of the RED agenda in front of government changes. So every time the government of Madre de Dios change, we have been able to capacitate and create the capacities of different people. So it doesn't matter if there's rotation in the government, there's always one person that attended the course. So that's actually been very encouraging. So yeah, different countries, different strategies, but the WWF has been working now for at least 4 years in RED, and we'll plan to continue working in alignment to the national focal points and national plans.
Thank you. So the next question is from Tobias, and Tobias asks, do you see any implications for RED Plus now that the negotiations move into other negotiation forums, such as INDCs, SBI, and Green Climate Fund?
Yes, I think that's a very good question. I think hopefully the implication would be that the RED agenda will have to be raised, the profile of the RED agenda has to be raised in the sense that it's not only a technical discussion. Now it's a matter of strategic discussions on how to really make sure that we guarantee that the support for RED will be there. One of the ways to do it, of course, is through the climate agreement and having it explicitly mentioned in the finance section of the agreement, but also as Tobias mentioned, there's much more work to do, for example, in the Green Climate Fund. The Green Climate Fund, we have a RED logic model that is very general, and we still need to work out what are the links between the Warsaw Framework for RED and the decisions that the COP has made, and how this relates and how this connects to the Green Climate Fund. So there's a little bit of a gap there in terms of deciding what are the modalities of finance, like how these two things connect and how the finance is going to be delivered to RED countries that achieve results. But under the GCF, there's also another way to access finance, and that's through the program cycle, the traditional or the classical programmatic approach that the Green Climate Fund has established. There's a possibility of access funds, not for results-based payments, but for other activities, for example, phase 2 of RED, that countries could be applying there. So I think hopefully the implication is a positive one, and it's okay, let's break the RED bubble of technical discussions and let's permeate the topic into national agendas and to really make sure that the finance is there. At the national level, I think progressing in the strategies now that the rules are clear, it also entails to make the links to other sectors, as I was mentioning. So hopefully we'll see this happening soon.
Thank you. And so the next question is from Sunita, and this is bringing it back up to a really high-level question. What are the main barriers for RED implementation in developing countries, in your opinion? And perhaps to add to that, have those changed now that these technical negotiations are finished?
Yeah, well, I think that's a very interesting question. And actually, I like this question because it brings us back to reality and a little bit away from the world of the UNFCCC and rules and decisions. I think we have tried to understand the barriers in the place we work as WWF, and we actually have made a little very general assessment of barriers in the places we work. Some of the barriers are technical capacities. In the sense of, for example, understand how the local level will fit or will plug into the national level, for example, in terms of monitoring. How the monitoring system that a country will develop will be fed by local data, local information. So that's still something that it's need to be worked out. And I think the challenge here is that sometimes subnational and local initiatives can move faster than national plans. So there's a little bit of a disconnection between the progression of national strategies in the development or the design and what the subnational regions or local initiatives can start doing. So the alignment of these two worlds is a challenge. There are other barriers related to, for example, being able to articulate integral strategies. So that means that it's not your traditional forest project in which you are going to do sustainable forest management or agroforestry or this and that. You actually have to adopt a landscape approach, see the landscape as an integral unit, and understand that what you do in agriculture will impact in forest, and what you do in forest also will have to impact in other land uses. So looking at the land as a landscape, as an integral unit, I think that's a challenge, and it has to do with administrative barriers, bureaucracy, and also technical capacities, right, to understand how to articulate these more integral strategies. And also bureaucratic and administrative barriers, because sometimes the forest people know exactly where to invest to address the drivers, but they don't have the capacity or the attribution to invest outside the forest sector. So that's another one. I'll be very happy to share with you some of the other barriers that we have. We made a presentation not so long ago on that, and I'll be happy to provide more information.
Sure. So we can make sure that that's posted on redcommunity.org, that presentation that Josefina mentions, for anybody who is looking for that. I'll make sure it's easy to find there. And Josefina, as you answer this next question, I'm going to advance the slide just so people can see some of the other RED resources that we have here through the WWF Forest and Climate Program. But the next question is from Max, and Max asks, what will happen if RED plus credits flood the carbon market?
Well, that's something that I think we don't know, because first of all, the provisions and the rules that have been adopted for RED at the moment are not explicit or do not create any specific guidance on markets or how these how RED units or RED credits would be tradable or not. I mean, there's really no detail or no rules on that. I think the reason why this hasn't been decided or discussed at the moment is because the issue of the new market mechanism is not only for RED, it involves other sectors. These discussions are taking place under the UNFCCC. There's a group of people, a group of negotiators that have been for many years discussing this new market mechanism. And in a more general sense, and the provisions of these discussions will also apply for the forest sector. So that's, I think, again, that's a disconnection there, because we cannot move forward with rules for RED plus markets if there's no clarity on the new market mechanism of the convention. So I don't know if there are the conditions for assuming that there will be RED credits flooding carbon markets, because the carbon market doesn't exist yet. But I think it would depend, I would say, Max, that it would really depend on the strategies that governments follow. there are governments that have been really openly against markets, such as Bolivia, and also Brazil has publicly said that RED for them it's a matter of public finance and it's not a matter of markets. So we'll have to. I mean, I'm sorry I don't have a more clear answer to you, but we'll have to wait and see if this new market mechanism is created, what would be the rules and how we make sure that the market promotes environmental integrity and deals with all sorts of problems.
Thank you, Josefina. And before you get on to the next question, I would just like to run people through this slide that's up really quickly to highlight some of the additional resources we have here. So we have policy briefs. You can find an archive of this learning session as well as previous learning sessions online. RED Community is our free online learning platform for RED practitioners, which I mentioned previously. And then we have a few weekly and quarterly updates that you are invited to sign up for. And then finally, you can find all of our information at panda.org/forestclimate. So please check out those resources and we hope you find them useful. And Josefina, our next question is again from Adriana, and it's looking at joint mitigation and adaptation. And she asks, what does it mean to use joint mitigation and adaptation? Does it mean that a country that applies joint mitigation and adaptation can count emissions reductions from RED, but at the same time they can use the same activities as part of their adaptation commitments? So I guess that a confusing or a complicated topic that could use some more explanation if you're willing.
Yes, and I think that's a very relevant question because I think part of the discussions that took place under the convention, it was precisely why are we now mixing adaptation and mitigation in the same discussion when we are talking about RED. If there's a group that is discussing adaptation and there's another group talking more broadly about mitigation, and we are here talking about RED, why we have to talk about joint mitigation and adaptation mechanism. I think our approach, I think it's just because in real life we don't, like, ecological system doesn't work in separate ways, and many of the actions that you can make in the forest sector could be very, very good for mitigation, but at the same time also for adaptation. So I think the Bolivian proposal wanted to make this point of, like, well, when we are going to be implementing, we are not going to implement an action that is only going to be good for adaptation or only good for mitigation. So that was the motivation, I think, from the side of the proponents, the government of Bolivia. In the sense of the formality of the discussions of the convention, it does pose a little bit of a challenge because discussions on adaptation have been progressing in their own bubble, the same as RED discussions have been progressing in their own bubble. So creating the links formally under the convention, it poses some challenges, and especially challenges in the sense of adaptation being a little bit more targeted or more focused towards make sure that there are no threats to, for example, let me think of an example, clear example. Okay, so a very controversial example is in adaptation, well, talking about agriculture. Do we talk about agriculture for adaptation or for mitigation? And that has been a really controversial issue under the convention. The majority of developing countries don't want to talk about mitigation. They want to only talk about adaptation and agriculture. So there is there are a lot of different intricacies under the convention, political reasons, grouping positions that make things sometimes complicated to be addressed in a more holistic way or more integral way. But for the case of the joint mitigation and adaptation mechanism, I think what I can say from personal perspective is there are many countries developing national RED strategies that include actions that are going to be good anyways for adaptation. So it's just a matter on how you set your national priorities or according to your national circumstances, how you can actually make this happen either under RED or under the joint mitigation and adaptation mechanism or approach that now has been recognized and that has been acknowledged in these last Bonn decisions. I hope that makes sense, but it's just a matter of understanding that you can propose activities in the ground, implement activities in the ground that are going to be good for mitigation and at the same time are going to be good for adaptation.
Thank you. So at this point, we have come to the end of our webinar. And so I just want to remind you that you can keep in touch with us through social media, through our website, and through email. So please, we're always looking for feedback on these webinar sessions. If you have input on how it went or questions you would like us to follow up on, please send us a note and we'd be happy to hear from you. And thank you again to Josefina. Thank you again to everybody who joined us today. And we run these webinars as a monthly series, so please keep an eye out for the next invitation for our for future sessions. So thank you, Josefina, and we'll talk to you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.